So welcome, everyone, to another wonderful talk in our ideas seminar. For those of you who are wondering, yes, the talks will continue, although not quite as frequently throughout the summer and then back into the fall. So stay tuned and so on. So today, I am absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker, Gordon Pennycook. Gordon comes from the University of Regina in Saskatchewan in Canada, and he's actually a psychologist. He studies things about decision making, about the relationship between linguistic cues, language, and how people behave, how they write, and so on. Some of his work was on pseudo-profound bullshit. It was actually extremely well received, to the point where he actually won, and this is so unusual, I've never heard of this before, the 2016 IG Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, I'm delighted to say that some of our own work is actually drew on some of his work in the development of cues, which led to some of our ways of measuring the Bend maneuvers. So for people who have used those, you'll know what I'm talking about there. With that being said, I want to give you Gordon Pennycook. Gordon, take it away.
Great, thank you. Hope you don't mind that I'm wearing my gamer headset, which I've never actually used for gaming, only for lectures, but improves the sound quality. All right, so I'm going to talk about some work that we're doing that relates to, basically why people believe and share false information. It does come from a psychological perspective, but our kind of thinking there is that if you want to develop interventions that slow down the share, at least to some extent, the sharing of false information, it kind of behooves you to understand the underlying cognitive mechanisms that explain that. And so we kind of take a cognitive science perspective. And then, so when I'm saying we, I'm referring to me and Dave Rand, who is at MIT. I did my PhD with my postdoc with Dave at Yale, and this is when we started doing this work together, and we haven't stopped since then. That was 2016 when I started. So it's been great. It's a bit of a kind of a weird experience to research misinformation with everything going on, because every day it becomes more and more relevant, it seems. But whatever. I find it an interesting outlet, so that's what we've been doing. Okay, so I don't really need to explain to this group the underlying problem, obviously. The Director General of the WHO said that fake news spreads faster and more easily than the virus. I'm not exactly sure if that's true, but there's little question that there's a problem that we're facing, that there's a lot of falsehood on the internet, fake news as it were, the specific spread of fabricated news headlines as opposed to just misinformation more generally. There's some debate about the extent to which that is being shared. To me, it's that's kind of important to figure out, but there's no question that there's lots of falsehood, and understanding why people share things that are false on social media is just a hugely important issue. So the question that we're going to start with here and basically focus on is just how do we stop, or at least more conservatively slow the spread of false information on social media. By the way, I don't mind if people ask questions throughout. I'll try to stop and see if people have any questions. There's certainly clarification questions, or any substantive thing. Interrupt me if you want to, or stay till the end and ask questions, and I don't really care, whatever you want. Okay, so this talk is, I'm going to say, mostly data. And so the next slide is already data, and what it refers to is the kind of initial thing, the thing that usually people think about when they want to stop the spread of false information on social media, and that's fact checking. Okay, so I mean, I'm fully on board with fact checking. I think it's really important that we fact check things, but as a strategy to stop the spread of misinformation, there are some issues with it. So for a bit of historical context, this is what Facebook did as their kind of initial strategy to slow the spread of misinformation. They put this warning label on fake news headlines, and it looked basically like this. It said, disputed by third-party fact checkers. You could click on the link and it'll take you to more information or whatever. But there's some issues with this. One issue is that it's just a design issue. It's not scalable, right? That is, if you're going to fact check articles, you have to put the work in to make sure that they're actually false. If you're going to put a tag that says it's false, and that takes time, and probably more time than it takes to make something up. And certainly by the time that you realize that there's stuff that's being spread that's false, it's already been seen by many thousands, if not, hundreds of thousands of people. And by the time you get the fact-checking warning label on there, a lot of the impressions, as it were, would have already happened. There's some research on what's called the backfire effect. If you're aware of that, the more recent research suggests that it's not probably something that happens. That is the idea that the warning label will cause reactance. People will believe it more because of the label. That probably isn't true. In most cases, if you actually fact check something, people will believe and share it less, but it's just not a scalable solution. There's also this other issue that we identified in a recent paper that we're referring to as the implied truth effect. So imagine that through some means, social media companies were able to keep up to some extent. They were able to label a fairly large proportion, like even 50% would be a pretty high proportion of false content. What we found in this paper is that one way that might backfire is that people might end up believing the headlines that are not warned about more. That is, if a lot of things are fact-checked and have warning labels on them, then people may presume that those things that do not have warning labels have been verified. And so what we did in this experiment, we give people some headlines that have these tags. In this case, we used a kind of blatant false warning so people would notice it. In this case, our dependent variable is whether people would share the headline. So in the control world there, people don't get any warnings at all. People share like 30% of the false headlines that we looked at in the study. If you warn about the headlines, that is those headlines that were warned about, people will share them less. That's good. They only share like around 15% of the headlines that have that false warning label. But the ones that don't have the warning label are actually shared more, right? That they think that because they aren't identified as false, that maybe they're more likely to be true, and then they share them more. And so this is a problem for the fact-checking approach. Another approach that people take that seems kind of obvious is to emphasize the source, right? Having information about the quality of a source, like that there's actually lots of information contained there that's really usable. I mean, the New York Times, despite some people's protestations, they don't just make things up. But freedomdaily.com, they do make things up, like this headline here, for example. And so what we did is a bunch of experiments where we emphasize sources, or we just remove the sources as a different kind of control. And what you basically find is that it has essentially no effect at all. And this is in a paper in Misinformation Review that's just came out. In fact, what it seems like the reason that there's no effect here is because the judgments that people make regarding whether they would share it or whether they believe it is based on the content of the headline. And it seems like most of the information that you garner about the kind of plausibility of the headline comes from the content itself and not from the source. So let me just explain this. First, I'll show you the data, then I'll explain what I mean by that. So this is what you see. This is judgments of accuracy in this case, not sharing. You can see that people can distinguish between the true and false, the fake and real headlines, but having the logo, the emphasizing the source, the real headlines being like New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, fake ones being like Freedom Daily, a bunch of sources that you've never heard of. It has no impact at all, okay? Which was to us a very surprising finding. And even if you remove the source entirely, it has no impact. And so it doesn't seem to matter that much when you're asking people to make judgments about headlines if it says New York Times or not, which is crazy. But if you think about it, it makes a little bit of sense, okay? So think about the context in which the source has high information value, okay? And that's cases where you don't trust the source, but the content seems plausible to you. So this is something that you might normally believe, but since it's not from a trusted source, then you won't believe it because you don't trust the source, right? Or in cases where you trust the outlet, but the headline is so implausible that you wouldn't normally believe it. In that case, having a banner or something that emphasizes the source may increase whether you believe it. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I guess, most of what we have, that is the reality of the headlines that we've assessed from the internet, seem to fit in this middle range, where those that come from trusted sources tend to be more plausible, the headlines themselves, than those that come from untrusted sources. And so the source information itself doesn't really provide that much information from an information processing perspective. Of course, from a journalistic perspective, it provides a lot of information, but just from a strict information processing perspective, it doesn't. And so this is what you see. We have we used a bunch of different headlines, the highest engaged headlines from 60 different sources, and you can see most of them are in that mid-range where there's a match between how much the sources should be trusted, how the quality of the sources, and the information that they're providing. And we have this in 2 different samples. Okay, so this initial just part of the talk is just to say 2 simple things, like fact checking and emphasizing the source, both have issues. Okay, and so that's the backdrop to what we're doing is if these simple things aren't going to work, then what can we do to help mitigate the spread of false information? And what I'm going to propose is just one intervention. Of course, there's other things that you can think of, but we have our own kind of favorite approach. So like I said at the start, if you want to decrease the spread of false information, you have to kind of understand why people share fake news in the first place. Okay, what is motivating to do so? One simple way to ask this question, an answer, I guess, is that it might be that people just cannot determine what's true and false. That is, they share false content because they're confused, that they don't know that it's false, and they can't really determine it. They don't have sufficient digital media literacy or political knowledge or whatever. Okay, so they're missing some sort of key information, and that's what leads them to share false information. We don't think this is the case. So I'll explain how we determine that with an experiment. So one thing that you can do in these studies is we give people, by the way, actual true and false headlines. Okay, so here it is. This is a fake headline. This is a made-up report from a website called dailyworldupdate.us. In every case, what we do is we take basically a literal screenshot of what the headline would look like on Facebook, and that's what we're presenting to people in these experiments. Okay, in this case, what we're going to do is we ask them just whether they think it's accurate. In this case, we did it with a yes/no answer, and that way we can get a proportion of people that basically believe the false or true headlines. But what you can also do is give them the headlines and ask, do you think that you would share this, right? Would you consider sharing it? We've asked this kind of question in different ways. How likely would you be to share it, or whatever? Some sort of analog to actual sharing behavior. This is all in the lab context. I do have an experiment later on using actual Twitter data, but I'll go through the lab experiments first. So what we do is we contrast the extent to which people can distinguish between true and false headlines when you ask about accuracy directly or when you ask about sharing. Okay, and we did this again most recently in the context of headlines that are false or true related to COVID-19, and we found, as you'll see, these similar results. So this is what you find, and I'll just talk to the data, and hopefully everyone, I don't lose anybody along the way. So when you ask about accuracy, if you ask people just to rate, kind of simply, do you think this headline is accurate or not? They're really good at distinguishing between the true and false headlines. Okay, you can see that, so even if that is just discordant and concordant means the person's a Democrat, and we pre-tested the headlines. Some of them are pro-democratic, and some of them are pro-Republican. So a discordant headline is if you're a Republican and the headline is pro-democratic, or vice versa for Democrats. Concordant is if you're a Republican and the headline is pro-Republican, vice versa for Democrats. Okay, and so what you can see here is that people are quite good at distinguishing between true and false headlines when asked about it directly, right? They believe the true headlines that are concordant, like 80%, the ones that are discordant, like 65%, and then they only believe the false headlines, around 20% to like 12%. So there's a huge gap between true and false headlines. Regardless of political alignment, the gap is a little bit bigger for concordant and discordant, but generally speaking, people can distinguish between the true and false headlines when you ask them directly. The question now is, do they distinguish between true and false headlines if you ask instead about sharing, right? And the answer is no, not at all. I mean, there's some difference here. They do share more of the true headlines that are consistent with their ideology than those that are false and also consistent. But when it comes to discordant headlines, they don't distinguish between true and false at all. They don't share a lot of them because they're inconsistent with their ideology. But you can see there's no difference there. and another thing I'd point out here is that those false headlines that are consistent with their ideology, which are being shared almost 40% of the time, are only believed like 20% of the time, right? These are two different groups of people. Like either we're asking about sharing or accuracy. But what this implies is that if these people who are sharing 40% of these false headlines were asked about accuracy, they would have been able to identify some of the headlines that they shared as being false, right? And what this implies, right, is that people can identify whether the headlines are true or false, but they're just not doing it. And this is true even in the case of these COVID-19 headlines. In this case, I've changed the axis a little bit. The true is in yellow and false is in green. You can see that here when sharing, people are sharing again around 40% of the COVID-19 headlines, but they only believe just a bit higher than 20% of them. And so again, people can identify, if asked directly, to some extent, the true versus false headlines, but they're just not doing this when they're sharing. They're not thinking about accuracy, it would seem. Okay, is that clear to everybody? Do I need are there any questions about that? Okay. So it does not seem to be the case that people just cannot tell the difference between true and false headlines. Okay. One other thing that might be happening is this kind of post-truth narrative that you might hear, and that it's that they're sharing things because they don't care that it's true or false, right? They have partisan motivations or some other inclinations, and they're kind of deliberately kind of ignoring accuracy because it's just not that important. But this doesn't bear out in the data. If we ask people, what do you think is the most important thing? What they tell you is that accuracy is actually the most important thing, right? It's not revealed in their behavior, of course. They don't really pay attention to accuracy, but they do definitely have a stated preference that it's important to only share accurate content. And I mean, if you just ask people, even people that you see sharing false content, they care about accuracy. They're just not really paying attention to it. And so our hypothesis is that the social media context kind of distracts people from accuracy. They have a stated and I think fairly strong preference to only share things that are accurate. People don't want to be, purveyors of falsehood. I mean, of course, there are some people that want to do that. Like there are trolls on the internet, of course. What we're talking about here is the kind of typical individual that you would see sharing false content. Most of those people still care about accuracy, but there's something about the social media context that's distracting them from it, right? And there's lots of things that you can think about here, right? They are looking for social validation or reinforcement, or they want to kind of attract followers, or they're signaling their group membership, or or whatever, right? The social media context incentivizes other aspects that are salient when you're looking at headlines, apart from accuracy, and accuracy doesn't seem to rate that well, unfortunately. In other words, like basically the platform design of social media companies is interfering with people's stated preference that they care about accuracy. They aren't thinking about accuracy enough when they're on social media. And you can also kind of just think about the way that social media works. Like a lot of the time, it's just pictures of dogs and babies and like kind of innocuous thing where accuracy is not really that important. And then you have a news headline where accuracy is super important, and people aren't in the right kind of mindset, essentially. Okay, and so the intervention that we are proposing is pretty straightforward. Given this, it's basically we can make accuracy salient. We can find ways to increase the likelihood that people will even consider accuracy when they're making judgments about what they would share on social media. Okay, and so the experiments that we use to do this are pretty straightforward. The control condition is precisely what I already showed you, where we just ask people, how likely they would be to share true and false headlines, and you can see that in here, as in the other experiments, people don't distinguish that well between true and false headlines, even for the COVID context. You can see that people across the studies, they're sharing more of the COVID stuff than the political stuff, which probably makes sense given the context. And so what we do for the treatment, the intervention in this case is really simple. Okay, all we do is we just ask people at the start of the experiment to rate the accuracy of a single headline. Okay, so we just give them one headline. In this case, it's a a true headline from CBS News, something one of those kind of wacky and interesting headline. We've done lots of different variations of this with different kind of initial headlines. It doesn't seem to matter that much. But the basic idea is that we say, as part of a different study, we just want you to rate this one headline, okay? And then you move on. You're going to do the real task, which is just telling us which of these headlines you think would be something that you would share on social media, essentially. And the idea is that this simple kind of reminder, this kind of nudge to think about accuracy, should make that aspect of sharing more salient, and therefore increase the extent to which people are discerning between true and false content on social media. Okay. By the way, it says 2016, 2017 here. That's because that's when the original study was run on this. We've been doing these studies for a while now. It almost always works out, and we have many cases where we've tried other things, like we give people a bunch of different headlines at the start and give them feedback, and you get a bigger effect when you do that, and some other things that I'll mention briefly after as well. So just to be clear here, the intervention is just to remind people that about accuracy. We're not telling them to use it. We're not telling them to think about accuracy. We're just doing something to prompt them to think about accuracy. Okay, and so the prompt is supposed to be minimal, and as I'll show you later, we have an even more minimal version of this. But in theory, you can do it, this kind of intervention, in lots of different ways. We're also testing things like ad-based interventions, where we give people an ad that reminds about accuracy to see if that has an effect and things of that nature. But so in terms of this experiment, the treatment here again is just, were they reminded about accuracy using that single headline or not? Okay, and this is what you see. So for the political headlines on the left, there's the difference. You see, there's basically a decrease for sharing it false, a slight increase for true, but the key effect is the increase in discernment, right? The gap between true and false, which is pretty small in the control, more than doubles in the treatment. The extent to which people are discerning between true and false content is like twice as high in the treatment when reminded about accuracy with that simple little nudge than when not reminded about accuracy. And then you see the same thing for the COVID context. Again, here the gap between true and false is about twice as it is twice as big if you ask about accuracy at the start of the experiment. Okay, so that's the basic intervention. We just want to trigger people to think about accuracy, and one way to do that is by asking them to rate the accuracy of a headline. Okay. Now, what you probably are thinking is like, that's all well and good, but this is hypothetical sharing, right? This is people getting people in the lab, or like in the lab. They're online studies. We use sources like Mechanical Turk, Lucid, Prolific, etc. We've done some studies with YouGov, but they're all in the context of a study, which is certainly an unnatural kind of context to make judgments about sharing. We have some data that shows that people do share, that is, the headlines that people share in our lab studies corresponds to those that are more likely to be shared on social media. And so they're not making random judgments, but it's still not the same as actually like doing this on a platform. Okay. So what we did was a Twitter experiment. Well, actually, it was a series of experiments that I'm going to just all show at once. And the way we did this is we created bots. Okay. In this case, they were cooking bots. They were nonpartisan. They were supposed to be kind of general interest bots, and we made a bunch of them. And what we did with them is we just used them to follow people who retweeted Breitbart. So Breitbart, if you're not aware, is a kind of right-wing, hyper-partisan news outlet. They are they produce very biased and misleading content a lot of the time. I mean, it's not made up in the same way that it's not fake news using that moniker, but it's deceptive and quite partisan. So it's rated also low, that is, by professional fact checkers in terms of trustworthiness. So it's not a very trustworthy source. It's low quality content on social media essentially, but one that has sufficient engagement that we can actually find people who tweet content from it. Okay, and so what we did with the bots is we followed a bunch of people on Breitbart. Okay, and a Twitter thing is that some people, even if they're getting followed by a cooking bot, will follow back the thing that is following them. Okay, and so we followed a lot of different people, and eventually we got up to about almost 5,500 people who followed us back, and that did not appear to be bots. Okay, and that forms our subject pool. Once somebody follows the bot, then we can send them a direct message. And this is what we did. We sent them a message asking about the accuracy of a headline, which wasn't, by the way, it's not in response to anything that they sent. We don't mention anything about Breitbart or anything in the study. We just send them this message, which we realize is a super weird message to get from a cooking bot. And of course, basically nobody responds to it. Some people don't open it at all. Everybody in the analysis I'm going to show you is just literally everybody who was messaged. But the idea is that we just want them to read the first line, right? They open it up and they see this kind of how accurate is the headline, this prompt to think about accuracy, which is pretty minimal, right? Extremely minimal, like, form of the intervention. They don't actually have to answer anything, unlike our lab experiments, and it's just one question, right? And then what we did when we're rolling this out is we just sent it to a different set of individuals each day. And so those individuals who did not yet get the message, that's the control group. Those who got the message, we're going to measure their tweeting for 24 hours afterwards. Okay, and so the DV here is the average quality of the news sources that they're tweeting. Okay, in a previous experiment or study on the trustworthiness of sources that was published in PNAS, we got 8 professional fact checkers to rate the trustworthiness of 60 pretty common sources. Okay, and so what we're going to do is just kind of aggregate across all these different tweets, take the mean level of trustworthiness for individuals. There's a bunch of different ways to do this analysis. And so what we did is a multiverse analysis where we look at all the possible variations and find overall, like, pretty strong evidence. But what I'm going to show you here is just the simplified kind of figure where we look at the change in relative frequency of tweets from different levels of trustworthy sources. Okay, and so this is for the 24 hours that follow our simple DM, and this is what you see. So for those sources that are the most trustworthy, New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, you see a kind of increase in tweets from those URLs. Okay, and it's simply just from the URL. We removed the ones that are opinion articles, which wasn't that many of them. Doesn't change the results. There's a lot of sources here that don't have enough signal, so the size of the circle is like how common the source was in our data set. So there wasn't, a lot of these things don't have much of an effect. But the most important thing you see is Breitbart, which is what we selected these people based on. They're tweeting less from Breitbart after the message, right? Which, to remind you, is a single DM to their inbox from a cooking bot that's asked them about accuracy, is decreasing the extent to which they're sharing content from low quality sources. Okay, if you look at discernment, which is the difference between low and high quality sources, basically, you see about a three time increase. So there's a pretty sizable effect there. It comes out to basically about a 5% increase in the average quality of the sources that people are sharing. Okay, and it doesn't matter how many followers the people have. So it's not just the low follower people who are being who have been impacted by the intervention. This seems to be kind of across the board. One thing I'll mention here is that this is a definitely, or at least almost certainly, an underestimate of the effect size, because we aren't screening people based on whether they opened or paid attention to the message, right? It's just, did they get the message or not? Okay, and so those who got the message basically shared content from more. They improved the quality of the content they're sharing on Twitter for 24 hours that followed. Okay, I'll discuss some of the issues with it that are probably coming to mind, like, will it last that long subsequently? But one thing I just wanted to mention briefly is that this is really easy to implement in a sense. I mean, it depends on the motives of the social media companies and all that, but a simple kind of pop-up asking people to help inform algorithms would be something that you could do. And in fact, we have other research showing that people's judgments about about headlines actually can be used to inform actual fact checking, and so it wouldn't even be pointless. There's other ways you can do it. You can like put a prompt in within the kind of timeline that people are scrolling through. We're also testing, like I mentioned, ad-based approaches where you just put ads that remind people about accuracy, things of that nature. So we're trying to scope out the what's effective and what are the possibilities for social media companies. But we do think that there's definitely possibility here in terms of implementing our idea. We also have some results showing that you can increase the extent to which people are discerning between high and low quality content or true and false content by just asking them to like indicate how important they think it is to not share inaccurate content, that is to only share accurate content. So you don't have to get them to actually rate a headline. If you just ask them, do you think it's important to only share accurate stuff, then they'll, that also makes them pay more attention to that dimension when they're making sharing decisions. You can imagine lots of different ways that you could ask that sort of question. If you just tell them other people think it's important to share accurate content, kind of like a PSA, where it's like we did one where it was 8 in 10 people think it's extremely important to only share accurate content, which is actually true. People stopped, they shared more accurate and less inaccurate content after having read that prompt. Okay, pretty straightforward stuff. We also show that as a kind of a side benefit, having people slow down and think more carefully actually does have an impact on whether they believe. What I've been talking about is whether they share content, sharing being crucial because you have to cut off the spread of false information. But in terms of actual belief, if people slow down a bit more, there's some evidence that it actually decreases whether people believe it or not, because they reflect more, they think more critically about the headlines if they stop for a second and actually ponder it. Okay. So I think we think that there's some kind of major advantages to this approach. One is that it's distributed, right? That is, we don't need someone or some group to distinguish between what's true and false to try to keep up, right? It depends on each individual's actual ability to determine what's true and false. And I mean, the reason that it works is because people, like I said before, don't do this by themselves. That is, they don't at least sufficiently consider whether something's accurate before they share it. And so if you get them to do so, it'll have some improvement. Of course, it's not a panacea. Like that is, some people aren't going to be able to distinguish between what's true and false. Certainly, and most people won't be able to do it in every single case. Some people will be able to hardly do it at all, and so it's not going to be effective for them. So it's not, this is one element of a broader kind of set of tactics that you could use to help decrease the sharing of false information. It's not going to work for everybody all the time, but it has some overall effectiveness, as we've shown. And also, I mean, importantly, it's scalable, right? We don't need fact checkers to keep up. It's something that you can implement fairly easily. Of course, there's some trade-offs there in the sense that what we're doing and what we've demonstrated is basically kind of existence proof for the concept, right? A single DM decreases sharing of false content or improves the extent to which people are sharing. The quality of content that people are sharing on Twitter, that's just one DM, right? And we started off, the first thing that we ever tried was asking people about accuracy. That doesn't mean that's the best way to do it. I talked about some other ways, but there's definitely room for optimization. And not just that, by looking at, who should be treated when, and when it's most effective in terms of decreasing the sharing of false content or misleading content in a network sense, to try to focus on those key nodes that are sharing false content. Obviously, we can't use the treatment on Donald Trump, who has a lot of influence on the share of false content on the internet, but in terms of the wider network, there could be some optimization there. Another thing you could do, of course, is changing the format, trying different versions of the thing to make sure that banner blindness, that is the intervention, doesn't kind of wear off. And we don't really know, by the way, how long it lasts. For the Twitter experiment, when you cut out, because of the way that the design works, the control group is whoever has not got the message yet. If you increase the amount of time you look afterwards, then that decreases the sample size. And so we don't really know how long it lasts. That's another place for future research. So But these are things that could be optimized if a social media company which has the data to assess these things and the means to do it quickly could optimize it and test the best possible solutions. To that end, what we're doing now is working with Jigsaw, which I'm sure you're familiar, but it's the R&D arm of Google, and we're trying to do that now. We're trying to work towards optimizing something or getting something that would work on platform, using, for example, the kind of Google News scroll that you see on Android phones, and things of that nature. So there's work to be done in terms of getting it out there to actually be a kind of product that's used by social media companies, but at least on the research side, there's promise there. Okay, so I'll just offer some conclusions. So the first issue is that fact checkers can't keep up. So fact checking is great. I love fact checking. It's important that we have things that people can see when they do bother to think about what's true, and then go through the extra step of like checking whether there's evidence for some sort of claim that they see on social media. But as a scalable solution or part of a solution, there's problems there. Okay. Emphasizing the sources would be scalable and simple, but it's not very effective, unfortunately. And so that's an issue. We do know, based on our data, that when asked directly, people are pretty good, surprisingly good at telling whether content is true or false. The problem is the attentional part, that they have to do that in vivo. They have to do that when they're on the platforms, and they don't seem to do it. They don't pay attention to accuracy as much as they ought to. Certainly, and probably like hardly at all in most cases. Okay, so what we find is that you can improve that aspect of it. You can get them to pay attention, and that has a demonstrable kind of impact on their choices. Okay, and so this ties into recent controversies on Twitter about and Facebook, where Facebook does not want to be an arbiter of truth. In this case, our intervention doesn't require them to be. I don't think that it's sufficient on its own, and they probably should do some moderation, but that's kind of a personal opinion. But there is room for this to work if only we could get them to listen to us, which is an uphill battle, obviously. One major caveat, though, is that all these studies that I talked about are run in the States. You don't really know how well it generalizes across culturally. We've done some studies in Canada during the election, in France and Italy during the EU elections last fall, and we found the same results. So that's good, but this is not sufficient for cross-cultural generalizability. We did do one experiment related to COVID-19 in China where we found consistent results, but again, we're not close to getting anywhere near cross-cultural generalizability, which is something that needs to be figured out. So if you're interested in the underlying papers that we're doing here, they're both still in the preprint working paper form, getting closer to getting published. So you can go check them out. Happy to share the links if you want, but they're on the screen there, so you can check it out or go to my website. You'll find them there. That's it. That's what I have. Thanks for listening, and here are the generous funders. Happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Gordon. Hi, this is Phil.
Hi, Phil. How you doing?
Great. How are you?
Good,
I
good to
really
see you.
enjoyed the talk. Really great work. I'm a big fan.
Thanks.
I have a question, if I may. So you showed that there is a measurable effect, and so in the lab you've shown that the gap doubles, and in the wild you showed that there is a clear effect, but of course it's not complete, right? It just explains part. Like, so you ruled out that it is because people don't care about accuracy or because they're not capable of discerning accuracy. But what you have found, which is their distraction or not thinking about accuracy, is not the whole problem, right? I'm a big fan of your intervention. It will help, but it will not solve completely the problem. So have you thought at all about what other factors could help explain the rest of the gap?
Yeah. So I mean, for the sake of narrative, I simplified the people simply can't tell. Like, there are definitely cases when people can't tell what's true or false. You know what I mean? And there are definitely cases where people are sharing things because they're being trolls. I think that the latter case is, so we did one experiment where we ask people to rate in the treatment whether they think that every single set of headlines that we gave them, we asked them whether they think it's accurate, and then whether they would share it. And so what you see there is that a small percentage, like 15% of the time that people share a headline, that they think they only share headlines that they think they're false 15% of the time. So the cases where people are like, I said it's false, but I'm still going to share it, that happens to some extent. But most of the effect that is, if you don't ask about accuracy, but then you ask about accuracy for every single headline, it decreases sharing by about 50%. So like based on that one experiment, probably about 50% of the sharing is based on inaccuracy, and then the rest is just they can't tell. They don't know what's true or false. So one thing that we've done is we did the accuracy nudge and also gave them a little blurb that gives them tips, like media literacy tips, like something that they can use to help with the process of discerning what's true and false, and then those compound to make a bigger effect. It's obviously harder to do. Part of the thing that we're trying to do here is come up with something that can be implemented, and then so every step that you add makes it harder to implement, but there are definitely things that you can do. I think basically it makes people reflect a bit more, and so all the things that you might think about that might help with that, like even having fact-checking warning labels might help compound the impact of those if you ask about accuracy first. You know what I mean? So that's the way that we're kind of thinking about it right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill.
Hi, this is Matt Babcock. Can you hear me?
Hi, I can hear you. You bet.
Okay. I had a question about. I'm wondering about the folks that realize it's false or realize it's inaccurate information and still share it anyway. And I'm wondering if there's a section of that community that's doing that in order to do amateur debunking or attacking it. They're sharing it in order to actually not to spread it because they believe in the message. They believe that it serves a purpose even if it's false, but they're sharing it to show examples of why things are, look at these guys, can you believe that they're doing this, that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you could discern how many people are doing that, whether or not you would see bigger effects in what you're doing if you took out those people.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like that, we don't know. We couldn't do that in the experiment that I mentioned where we asked people about accuracy for every headline, but in the Twitter experiment, we can distinguish between the people's retweet without comment, which is sort of more of an endorsement, and then when they make a comment. We haven't gone through, and you basically find the effect in both cases, but we haven't gone through the cases where people have made comments, but we're saying, can you believe how egregious this is, right? Which is definitely a different thing, right? And so that's another way that our effect is it's probably being underestimated because some extent of the sharing is because people are sharing it to illustrate that it's false. So that's a great point. It's just difficult to do because we have to go through thousands of tweets basically and find some way to code that. If people have suggestions on how to do that, please get in contact with us. The data is available too, so that would be great for collaborations and so on. The one thing I'll add to that is that like the percentages that I said, they're not particularly meaningful, because it really depends on the issue and the historical context and all that kind of stuff. And so you can imagine the percentage of people that are tweeting about a particular comment because it's so egregiously wrong and they're outraged about it depends a lot on what the content is and all that. So that's an important caveat to keep in mind.